Hey, let's talk about sex. Hi, I'm your host Naomi, and this is Mosaic in Progress. As always, check the show description for content and trigger warnings. If you grew up evangelical like me, then you probably grew up in purity culture, and sex is probably a really uncomfortable topic for you now for multiple reasons, mostly because it was always taboo in any context. Even healthy discussions of sex or normal curiosity and just basic functioning type questions were always treated with such a delicacy of like you were handling a time bomb that any discussion of sex for anyone raised in purity culture just feels wrong. And so let's talk about it today. I think I was 12 when my mother finally had the talk with me, and I was absolutely horrified. Just, from a strictly like, oh my God, that's really how that works standpoint, and also just completely embarrassed and humiliated that my mother, who could barely even say the word sex, even if she was referring to gender, had such a graphic discussion with me. It was honestly kind of traumatic for me, particularly because she told me that it would hurt and it was supposed to hurt and that was normal. So that was terrifying. And it was just this really weird, like, I don't know, like it was like you're supposed to like it, but you have to not want it kind of discussion that was like so confusing to me at the time. Like, okay, God designed me to want it, but I'm not supposed to want it or think about it. And also, that's all that men do, so I'm supposed to, like, make sure that I don't encourage that. Like, at 12 years old, I became responsible for the thoughts of my male peers and grown men. And it was, God, I look back on it and that was just such the most cringe-worthy way to tell a child about sex and what it is. And there was like no lead up, really. You read any kind of like parenting advice now and it's like, okay, here's age appropriate discussions about sex, and there's like this build up, you can talk about this at this age and this at this age, and there's just this kind of, gradual progression towards full knowledge. There was nothing gradual. It was like, we're not going to talk about this, you're too little to know about it. Then it was like, let me tell you. So the man puts his penis in your vagina. That's going to get me some kind of like flag on this show, I'm sure, for saying that. Anyway, that was literally, and I was just like, I'm sorry, what? What happens now? What? And she was like, it does hurt. And I'm like, eh? It sounds like a bad time for me. Why would I want that? That sounds like a really bad time. Why would anyone do this? Why would anyone do this? And you're telling me that it feels good, but it hurts? I'm very confused. So that was my, like, introduction into sexual knowledge, was my mother telling me that. And that was pretty much, honestly, the extent of it. Then she got, like, very biological with it about sperm and eggs and, the development of an embryo and how that process works. And I just remember feeling like really dirty and confused and disgusted and like, I don't know if I ever want to do this. This just sounds gross and awful and bad, and at the same time just like really curious. But she was so uncomfortable having the discussion. I didn't feel like I could ask her anything about it because there was so much shame in the discussion, so much shame around like natural biological urges that it certainly didn't feel like a topic that was up for any kind of a frank or open discussion. And so, as you know, I hit puberty within like a year of that, and I started bleeding, and my hormones started changing, and I was just like, okay, I'm more curious now, but she's definitely not the person I can ask about it. And so I did what anyone of my generation did who had access to the World Wide Web, and I went looking for information on the internet, which I'm sure you can imagine where that led me. And I got in huge trouble for that eventually, once they figured out what I'd been looking at. And it just increased my shame around sex and my drive and sexual urges and curiosity to the point that I just felt like I was a dirty and sinful person just for having natural biological urges. And that really honestly didn't go away at any point in my growing up. I just carried that with me into adulthood, well into adulthood. And when I was sexually assaulted in 2011, it just kind of, I just sort of pushed the shame aside. It wasn't that it wasn't there, I just chose to ignore it and started my own kind of exploration of who I was sexually, and carried so much guilt and shame for that through that exploration. It wasn't that I didn't do it, but I certainly didn't do it with an open heart and with allowing myself to do it without shame. And so it kind of complicated the whole journey that was supposed to be me healing. And it wasn't until, ironically, I spoke to a lady at church about it. And there were several ladies at church who knew about my escapades and tried to help me overcome my slutty, promiscuous ways with prayer and mentorship and etc. And this one very kind older lady sat me down one day and listened to me cry about what a horrible person I was. And she said, you know, you don't have to work on everything all at once. And there are some things that you can take a break from working on. Just because it's a problem doesn't mean you have to work on it nonstop. God knows we're going to sin. That's why he sent Jesus. He knows we're going to sin in the next 5 minutes. And if you need to take a break from working on that because you're thinking about it too much and what you're doing isn't working, then give yourself a break. Work on something else. Because there's always things that we have about ourselves that we can work on. And that was the best advice that anyone had given me. And once I let myself off the hook of feeling guilty about it and just beating myself up about it, it became something that was no longer a problem. When I was not obsessing about not being who I was and trying not to have natural biological urges, suddenly it wasn't a problem for me anymore. And once it was no longer a problem, then I could look at it with a different eye. And I could examine it in myself without shame and judgment. And that was honestly one of the early steps in my deconstruction. And I know I've said that about other things, but there were several main categories that led to my deconstruction. And sex was a big one of them. And it was just kind of this very just honest confusion about expectations laid out in the Bible. Because the majority of things that are listed as sins in the New Testament are things that involve hurting someone else, harming others. And then, of course, they're the ones related to worship. But there's not a whole lot. If you look at it, it's just like, don't do this because. It has to do with how you treat other people. You know, even if you look at the verses related to modesty for women, which have absolutely nothing to do with sexual attractiveness or revealing clothing, it has to do with showing off your wealth, but nobody wants to look at it in context or read what the verse really says. It has to do with showing off your wealth, which is a harm to others when you're parading your wealth around those who have less or may have none. That is a harm to others. That is an action you do that affects others. And there's so little in there that's just like, don't do this because you don't do this. Except when it comes to sex. And I found that very confusing. And I thought there must be something more. Perhaps it's a mistranslation. Perhaps it's a misunderstanding. But it doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit with the rest of the commandments, the rest of the expectations. And so as I started looking into it, I realized that you will not find in the New Testament a prohibition on rape. And that made me wonder, did we take a word that meant rape and use it to mean consensual sex? And I have my own opinion about that, and I don't have a whole lot to back it up with, except that the word fornication comes from the root word for prostitute. And if you look at prostitution of the time, most of it was sexual slavery, which means that if you were engaging with prostitutes, you were either abusing a slave or you were engaging in an idolatrous practice with the priestesses related to the Roman gods or whatever pagan gods of the time that were being written, the people were being written to. Most of it was in the Roman Empire. But I don't know that there's been a study on that or that anyone has ever come to that conclusion. That is my belief based on the etymology of the word and context. And I came to the conclusion that it doesn't make sense to have so much sexual prohibition in the midst of so much else that is just like, do what you want to do, just don't hurt people. And that was kind of the whole point of the gospel. If you look at the early writings, particularly when the Jewish apostles were being told, you know, the old law is done away with now. You don't follow that anymore. All of these strict prohibitions are gone. It was essentially do what you want to do, just don't hurt people and don't follow other gods. And once I came to that conclusion, I pretty much just let go of my conscious decision to hold on to guilt and shame around my sexuality. And I've done another episode about homosexuality in the Bible and my conclusion or what I found in my research on that. But one of the biggest things that I really didn't expect is that there is an ingrained shame that came with being raised in purity culture. There is an ingrained submission in women that comes with being raised in purity culture. And there is an ingrained aggression in men who are raised in purity culture. And you don't get rid of that just by deciding you're not going to hold on to those beliefs anymore. I still experience shame sometimes for having sex with my husband, which is very weird, considering that even in purity culture, you're raised that that's what you're supposed to, that's what marriage is for. But the thing about training your brain to not want something and to feel guilt for wanting something is that doesn't just go away because you say vows or put a ring on your finger or sign a paper or whatever. It's there because you trained your brain to feel guilty. And it's a really wild thing to deal with on the outside of that culture and that belief system, to still be experiencing that. All of the shame that you tried to let go of. I think one of the biggest catalysts, I would say, for me in healing my wounds around sexuality was joining in with sister circles. There was a woman in my area at the time who was doing sacred sister circles, which I had never heard of before and was kind of skeptical about at first. But they were life-changing for me. It was wonderful to gather with women, and for the most part, women who had also been through some kind of trauma or abuse related to their sexuality, even if that just meant being a woman and being raised in America and our misogynistic patriarchal society. And in various stages of healing, and just being able to gather with them and sit and see and be seen and witness and create a community of healing and support one another in that healing and in that witnessing of ourselves and each other in wherever we were at. And it was not something I ever would have conceived of on my own. It came to me exactly when it needed to come to me. And it left when I was really outgrowing it. But it was instrumental in me learning to accept myself and to view sexuality as more than what I had been taught that it was. Sexual energy is the energy of creation. And when we talk about sex and we talk about sexual energy, we just think about copulation. And it's so much more than that. It is the energy of passion. It's the energy of creativity. It is the energy that brings newness into being. And yes, that is sometimes new life, and sometimes it is a baby. But sometimes that energy is what sparks a painting, and sometimes it is what sparks a business, and sometimes it is what creates a home. It is the essence of being. It is that spark that ignites, that sets everything else off. It is magic. And when you degrade it and diminish it to nothing more than a physical act, you ignore the power of sexual energy. And I didn't realize that for my entire life. And the more that I realized it, and the more that I studied and learned about it, the more I realized why the evangelical church is so afraid of sex. And they are. They are absolutely terrified of sex. They look at it as this mysterious thing that you shouldn't want, but they know is part of life, and okay, after you meet these certain requirements, you can do it, but you have to be careful with it because it might lead you away from God. They are terrified of it. They're terrified to talk about it. And the ones that do, the ones that speak openly, have such a perverse view of it that they do even more damage. There is within the evangelical church a terror of sexual energy and power, particularly when associated with women. They are absolutely terrified of women being empowered, and particularly being sexually empowered, because the entirety of the evangelical Christian church rests on ensuring that women are subjugated, particularly sexually subjugated, because if you sexually subjugate them, you can spiritually subjugate them, because sexuality is spirituality. And if you are interested in that topic more, I highly recommend reading the book Aphrodite's Daughters by Jalajah Bonheim. And I probably butchered her name, and I'm sorry. It is Jalaja, and her last name is Bonheim. And the entire book is about how sexuality and spirituality are connected. And that was one of the most healing books that I have ever read in my entire life, because everything made sense. It wasn't a new perspective, it was permission to accept the perspective I already had. I found God in sex more than I ever did in church. But no one wants to talk about that, because then you sound crazy. And you sound like some kind of weird person who has no grasp on reality, because it's so much easier to accept finding God in some form of organized religion with rites and buildings and rituals and an organized structure than it is to accept finding God in the thing that creates human life. For some reason, that's a hard thing to accept. For some reason, finding God in pleasure is a hard thing to accept, because the evangelical Christian church was built primarily on puritanical beliefs. And the Puritans didn't like pleasure, ironically. They thought it was sinful. They thought you should avoid things that were pleasant, things that made you happy, things that were unnecessary, things that were just for feeling good. And that belief system has stayed. It has become the root of the American Evangelical Church. It is the foundation of it. And while most members of the American Evangelical Church would not espouse beliefs as extreme as the Puritans, for the most part, they certainly will in certain areas. I grew up believing that sex was just for making babies, and that was the only reason to ever have sex. And then when you were done having kids, you were done having sex. Imagine my surprise when I found out that was not true. I mean, not to worry, my mother was quick to make sure that I also knew that it was shameful for that to be going on, or for anyone to know about it. That it shouldn't be discussed. It shouldn't really be known. I can't really even fully explain how negative a view I had of sex that was given to me by my mother. My father wouldn't really talk about sex, and the few times that he did are way too horrifically traumatic for me to convey over this podcast, and that's saying a lot because I convey a whole lot of horrific, traumatic things, but the few discussions that he had with me about sex were some of the most vile, disgusting, and inappropriate conversations I ever had with my father, and I look back on them with horror and disgust. And I think that certainly contributed a lot to my view of sex being bad. But I had this conflicting viewpoint within me. I had the viewpoint that was given to me, and then I had the one that was organic, the one that I had as mine. And I struggled with that for most of my life, and it wasn't until the last few years that I really found the source of most of my inner conflict. And that was that I believed what other people told me instead of what I either had evidence and knew to be true, or had formed my own opinion about and believed. And realizing that I was living my life based on other people's belief systems was both freeing and heartbreaking. Because when you realize that you've lived your life and you're an adult and you have been living your life by someone else's standards just because they told you that's what you're supposed to do, not because you believe it, not because you're convinced of it, just because they were very persuasive and very persuasive in telling you that you didn't have the capacity to know truth. And the ironic thing about that is that intuition is a huge part of sexual energy. And when I started tapping into my intuition and listening to my intuition and feeling into my intuition and following my intuition, all of the other beliefs that weren't mine started falling away. And not just, oh, I'm not going to hold on to that anymore. I called in what I needed. I invited in evidence and truth. And in fact, I specifically called it in. At the beginning of 2019, I decided I was not going to be a slutty whore anymore. And I was going to conquer it that year if it was the last thing that I did. And so I prayed a prayer to God. Still going to church then. At the beginning of that year, it was on New Year's Day, and I said, please help me conquer this struggle. And help me conquer the struggle within me of feeling that maybe I am justified in this. Present to me the evidence of truth. Put it in front of my face so that I will not be able to unsee it. I won't be able to deny it. I will know it is true and be unable to look away. I will be unable to deny it and live life any differently than following that truth. My goal, as I just stated, was to conquer my sin problem of sex. What happened instead was I was presented with evidence repeatedly over and over again that the Bible is not the infallible Word of God, that the church as it exists today is not a thing that would be pleasing to anyone who wrote the Bible, and that a good portion of the Bible does not even fit in there with the standards by those who placed it together. And that led to me leaving the church. And having more sex. It was a very weird year, and the following year was even weirder. But one thing I can say about it is I pursued truth throughout it. And there are people who think that I left the church just because I wanted to sin. And I wanted to be excused in my sin. And I wanted people to accept me in my sin. And I didn't want to be held accountable for it anymore. That could not be farther from the truth. Even after leaving, I still feel guilt for things that I no longer believe to be wrong. I wasn't trying to escape accountability. I, more than anything, wanted to follow truth, and I have been so committed my entire life to following the truth that when I was finally confronted with the evidence that the belief system that I had grown up in, the belief system that I had held on to my entire life, the belief system that I found comfort in through every difficult period of my life, the belief system that I had tried to bring others into, the belief system that lost me friends, the belief system that distanced me from family, that belief system was not infallibly true. And when I realized that, I could not stay in it any longer. And once you have walked out of a belief system, I almost said abuse system, ironically, Freudian slip there. Once you've walked out of a belief system that is so controlling and so full of rules and regulations and mandates, and those aren't there anymore. It's really weird because you're like, well, where are the boundaries? And you have to figure them out for yourself, because there's not some book listing them out where somebody else told you what you're supposed to do in life. And I arrived at the conclusion that as long as I'm not hurting anyone, it's not really much that's off limits. And I think that the thing that distinguishes us from other species is our ability to experience pleasure and our ability to use pleasure as a means of divine elevation. And what I mean by that is a means to connect on a higher level with divinity, with higher consciousness, with each other. Sex is magic. Sex is creative energy. Sex is more than just copulation. It is more than just making babies. And anyone who views it in such narrow and small terms has limited their life and what they experience. And I hope that you, my dear listener, have not limited yourself. Because sex is your ability to dance, to sing, to paint, to make music, to play, to make a home, to create a life, create a business. Sex is your life force and what you create with it. And I hope that you create something beautiful and never limit yourself based on other people's beliefs. This concludes our brief discussion of sex. I hope you will join us next time on the podcast. Please follow us. We're on Facebook, Instagram. Follow us anywhere you listen to podcasts. And I will look forward to our next meeting as we both continue to work on our mosaic in progress.